My parents hate me because I'm infertile. They convinced my husband that I deserved someone better, but 3 years later, everyone is shocked to find me with a baby, and they beg me for another chance. So, at 30 years old, I recently found myself with my parents and my ex-husband Scott, a 33-year-old man. I really don't know how to feel about this meeting. To give some context, my parents and I hadn't spoken for almost 3 years, and the same goes for my ex-husband. We divorced 3 years ago, and since then, we hadn't had any contact. In fact, I've done everything possible to avoid seeing them again because they practically ruined my life and mental health when I was still with them, to the point where I felt like I didn't even deserve to exist. After my divorce, I moved to the suburbs and tried to build a life away from everything and everyone connected to my past. So, running into them recently was a huge trauma for me. And somehow, I said some things that I'm not sure were the best for me. My parents had always wanted a son, though they never treated me badly while I grew up. It was pretty obvious they would have treated me differently if I had been a boy. My mom even mentioned this several times. I tried to be the son they never had, but I couldn't manage it. After graduating from college and starting to live on my own, I still tried to keep in touch with my parents because no matter what happened, they were still my family. They were the only family I had since I wasn't particularly close to my grandparents and didn't have uncles or aunts who were there for me. So, I accepted my fate. No matter how distant they were still my only family, even though they didn't seem very interested in staying in touch. I still tried to keep the communication going. When I was about 23, I started dating Scott. We met at a concert and there was an instant spark. After dating for 6 months, I introduced him to my parents, and that's when they started making more of an effort to stay in touch with me. They called me more often and asked about my relationship. They basically showed more interest in my life. I noticed this change, but since it was a welcome one, I didn't think much of it and just accepted it. The more I dated Scott, the more involved my parents became in my life. At one point, I felt like we were all a big, happy family, and I was pretty happy about it because it was all I had ever wanted. So, I didn't question it, even though I really should have. Anyway, after a little over 2 years of dating, we got engaged and then married after spending 3 years together. After getting married, things were pretty good for a while, and I was enjoying my life as a newlywed. But 6 months after my wedding, my parents started hinting that they wanted a grandchild. I was only 26 at the time and wasn't exactly ready. I wanted to wait a couple more years before starting to try for a baby, but with their insistence, I talked to Scott, and he was in favor of starting a family. So, because of his enthusiasm, we decided to start trying to have a baby shortly after we got married. We didn't try for long, but after several months without success, we started to suspect that something might be wrong and decided to get tested. Unfortunately, it turned out that I was infertile. It was a huge shock for both of us, but more so for my parents, who were disappointed and didn't even bother to hide it. The day we told them, my dad actually left the room instead of comforting me. We decided to stop trying for a while, and Scott and I discussed trying other methods, like in vitro fertilization. But that would cost us a lot, and success on our first attempt wasn't even guaranteed. So, we had to put our plans for starting a family on hold until we saved up enough money to afford several rounds of IVF. We were okay with that, even though we were a little upset. But my parents were extremely unhappy. They stopped visiting me, stopped talking to me, and no matter how much I tried to explain that it wasn't exactly my fault, they just weren't willing to listen. After a few weeks, I was so disappointed by their behavior that I called them and told them what I thought. I told them they had been treating me with so much cruelty just because I couldn't give them a grandchild at that moment. It made me doubt whether they could even be good grandparents when I could finally have a child. I told them they had treated me harshly my whole life just because I wasn't a boy, and I could see how they treated my husband differently. For a long time, I had tried to ignore all of this and keep our relationship. But now, I didn't want to stay in contact with them. I would appreciate it if they stayed away from me forever. It was really hard for me to do this because for so long, I wanted nothing more than their approval, but now I realized it was practically impossible. Instead of apologizing, They decided to insist on what they were doing and were fine with me not talking to them again because, according to them, I wasn't worth anything as a woman since I couldn't have children, and they didn't want anything to do with me. It hurt to hear them say this, but at least I knew where I stood with them. After that call, I really didn't speak to my parents again, and our relationship ended. When I told Scott about that call, he was very understanding at first, but after a few days, I started to notice that even his behavior toward me was changing. At first, I ignored it because I was going through such a mentally difficult time, and I didn't want to admit that maybe even my husband was going to leave me. I started pretending nothing was happening and everything was fine, but within months, he had become a completely different person, and he was really cold toward me all the time. I did everything I could to save our relationship, putting in as much effort as I could, but it didn't help. After 3 months, he came home with divorce papers and said it was over. I couldn't say I was surprised, but I still tried to reason with him and told him we could always try to have a baby later. But he told me there were too many issues he wanted to leave behind and just didn't want to be involved in them anymore. He wanted this to end as soon as possible because it was hard for both of us. The divorce took almost 7 months to finalize, and those were the hardest months of my life so far. I was completely alone and had really fallen apart. To make matters worse, a couple of weeks after he told me he wanted a divorce and moved out, I found out from some relatives that Scott was apparently living with my parents. I knew talking to them would help, so I decided to talk to my in-laws about it. It was a very awkward conversation, but they said my parents had apparently been in contact with Scott during the past few months. I guess they had been manipulating him into leaving me or something like that. That's why Scott decided to leave. Although my in-laws didn't think it was a good idea, he had argued with them and wasn't talking to them anymore. I don't know the specifics of what they told Scott, but I remember my in-laws telling me that Scott had hinted my own parents told him he deserved something better. I'm still not sure exactly what they told him, but I guess they were desperate to have a child in any way, since they could no longer expect a grandchild from me. So they took Scott under their wing and managed to get him to leave me. After the divorce, I was pretty broken, and it took me several months to recover, but I did it. Since then, I haven't looked back and have done everything I can to forget the past and move on. After the divorce, I moved to the suburbs, got a new job, changed my appearance, and blocked my parents and Scott on social media. I also told all my old friends and family that I didn't want to hear anything about them ever again, and didn't want them to know anything about me. Everyone respected that, and over the past few years I've been in therapy and living pretty well. The only thing that had been bothering me was the absence of a baby because, even though I no longer had a husband or parents, I still wanted to have a child. I felt ready to be a mother. Last year I started in vitro fertilization treatments, and I got pregnant with the help of an anonymous donor. 4 months ago, I gave birth to my baby girl. Life has been pretty great since her birth, and I'm really happy. 4 days ago, I was walking down the street with her when I ran into my parents and Scott. At first, I was really surprised to see them on my street and thought they were here to see me, but I realized they were coming out of a house a couple of blocks away. When they saw me, I literally froze, and I should have gone home, but I just didn't have the strength to move. They came up to me, greeted me, and then immediately asked about the baby because, according to them, I was infertile. I told them the truth. By then, I had processed what was happening, and I was starting to head back home. But Scott stopped me and said he was really happy to have run into me because he had been thinking a lot about me recently. Apparently, they had come here to visit his aunt, who had recently moved into this neighborhood. Scott thought meeting me was a sign from the universe that he needed to fix things with me and give our relationship a second chance. My parents were also there and insisted that I invite them to my house so we could talk about everything that had been happening in my life, as they clearly had missed out on a lot. Honestly, it horrified me that they were saying all of this and actually thought I would invite them after everything that had happened. It took me 3 whole years to get over this, and I'm still in therapy, working through my feelings. So, I had a little outburst. I told them I'd rather invite a group of bloodthirsty wild animals into my house than them, because even they would be better. I told them to stop acting and pretending they actually cared about what was happening to me because the only reason they wanted to talk to me was because I now had a baby. My parents wanted to talk to me because they were finally going to have a grandchild, and Scott wanted to talk to me because, obviously, he hadn't been able to find anyone else and thought that since I had been able to get pregnant once, getting pregnant again wouldn't be a problem, and he could re-enter my life. It was disgusting that all they saw in me was a source of babies, not a real person with real feelings. They had all abandoned me when I needed them emotionally. Although I expected that from my parents, because since my childhood, they had made it very clear that they would much rather have a son, and that, in their opinion, a woman's only worth was defined by whether or not she could be a mother. The real surprise had been Scott. He had spent so many years with me, even comforting me. But despite all that, he aligned himself with what my parents had said for some twisted reason and left me when I was at my lowest. I hadn't forgotten any of the things they told me, so I just repeated them. Since I was useless as a woman and Scott deserved something better, maybe they should leave me alone now. Honestly, I've always been a very calm and shy person, but when they confronted me on the street that day, I was shouting at them with all my might. It was 3 years' worth of accumulated rage coming out in one go. So, it was pretty unpleasant. Once I finished shouting at them, I headed home and slammed the door as fast as I could. I felt extremely bad afterward, so I decided not to go to work for a couple of days and have been at home with my baby ever since. My interaction with my parents and Scott kept repeating in my head in a loop. Honestly, I didn't know what to do about it until last night when I received a call from an unknown number. I don't know why, but I usually don't answer calls from numbers I don't recognize, but yesterday I decided to answer. It was Scott on the other end of the line, and behind him I could hear my parents whispering in the background. I'm pretty sure they weren't even trying to be discreet. They actually wanted me to know they were there. Anyway, I tried not to let it affect me too much. I just told him I didn't want him to call me again because if he did, I would be forced to take preventive measures against him, and I didn't want to do that. I told him the same went for my parents. I didn't want anything to do with them, and the only reason I had answered the call was so they would know that it was over. It had been over for 3 years, and I would continue to stand firm on that. But Scott asked me to listen to him, and despite myself, I couldn't hang up, so I let him talk. He said he knew he had made mistakes, and so had my parents, but everything had come from a place of disappointment. He said both my parents and he had really been hoping to start a family and have a baby in the family. Finding out that I was infertile and wasn't even willing to go through IVF until we had enough money was hard for them to accept, and they hadn't handled it in the best way possible. But now they really wanted me to give them a second chance to show that they were worthy of being part of my family. After a few seconds, I told them I didn't believe any of the nonsense they were trying to sell me. They wouldn't have cared if they hadn't seen me with the baby that day, and that was the crux of the matter. That was the truth, and I was tired of them pretending that it wasn't. I was about to hang up, but my parents intervened from the background and said that was exactly the kind of behavior I had been cut off for. Apparently, they believed I had been very selfish and only thought about myself when I found out I was infertile. Instead of giving them space, I kept forcing myself on them, trying to get them to console me and pay attention to me all the time, even though they were struggling with the news themselves. That's why they all ended up distancing themselves from me, which is how I ended up in the position of having no one for myself. I didn't continue the conversation after that. I just hung up. I know they were just trying to manipulate me. Update 1. I decided to talk to my ex-in-laws to find out exactly why Scott had behaved the way he did. Honestly, I couldn't think of any reason why he would need to visit his aunt with my parents. It was just strange. I already knew it wasn't my fault. They had abandoned me when I needed them the most because they are terrible people, and I knew they were just trying to manipulate me. I just wanted some peace and didn't want to bother my friends with this since it's very personal, which is why I posted it here. So, thank you to everyone who gave me peace of mind and made sure I knew I wasn't the bad one in this story. Anyway, it was pretty uncomfortable reaching out to my ex-in-laws after 3 years of no communication because the last time I spoke with them was around the time of the divorce. But luckily, they were pretty happy to hear from me. After a bit of small talk, I decided to get straight to the point and asked them why exactly Scott was so close to my parents and whether they had been in contact with him. They told me that a few months after their last fight, they had actually managed to reconcile with Scott and had been in contact with him at that time. However, He had also kept in touch with my parents. They told me that Scott had been loved as a child, so it wasn't like he was trying to replace his parents with mine. Apparently, my parents had been quite suspicious of our relationship from the beginning. They tried to win his favor even while we were dating. Scott used to tell his parents that my parents would occasionally invite him to dinner when I was busy, and he would go be with them separately. He thought this was something to brag about because he believed he had impressed my parents just by being himself. This was true because he was a man, and that was enough to impress my parents. So, they had spent a lot of time alone with him without me knowing. He had started to consider them parental figures, although he also respected his own parents. It was really complicated. Also, my parents constantly showered him with very expensive gifts and wrote him checks all the time. This was the money Scott offered to use for the IVF when we were together. I thought he was joking because, at the time, we didn't have that kind of money, and I didn't want him doing anything shady for money. I didn't want him to tell me he had received so much money from my parents, because then I would have to confess the kind of relationship I had with them. But even after that, I refused to go through with IVF because I didn't think we had the money, and I wanted to save. That's what my parents used to manipulate him and tell him he deserved something better, someone who trusted him. Eventually, in a few months, they managed to brainwash him, and that's how he ended up leaving me. My ex-in-laws apologized to me for this, but they also explained that even though they didn't agree with the kind of relationship Scott had with my parents, he was their only child, so they couldn't cut him off either. I don't blame them. They owe me nothing and were just kind enough to tell me the truth. But now that I know the truth, I have no reason to entertain them. If they contact me, they are repugnant people, and they're not worth my time. Update 2. I finally decided to go back to work after taking almost 2 weeks off. Fortunately, I still have plenty of maternity leave days left since I didn't take the full 6 months at once, and my company's policy is quite flexible. At home, it was just my daughter and her nanny, who I trust completely. She has many references, and I know her personally. She's really a good person. In the middle of the workday, I received a call from her. She immediately informed me that she had decided to take my daughter to her house because she wasn't sure if it would be safe for her to stay at mine due to my ex-husband. I agreed for her to take my daughter to her house for safety and called the police while quickly heading back. During the call, she told me that Scott had been outside for a few minutes, shouting for me to come out. When he realized I wasn't there, he started trying to break down the door, cursing loudly, which made my daughter cry. She quickly thought of calling me so I could notify the police, and she was able to leave through the back door and walk to her house through the garden gate since she lived just a few minutes away. This way, my baby would be safe while I dealt with my ex-husband and the police. I truly appreciate her for prioritizing my daughter's safety and well-being. That's how it should be. When I got home, the police had already arrived, and it was obvious that Scott had been drinking. It was strange because it was around noon, an odd time to be drunk, but there he was. I decided to press charges against him because he really made me angry, and I wanted him to leave. This also gave me a reason to get a restraining order against him, as he was clearly losing control. They managed to take him away, and a few minutes later, my nanny came back home with my daughter. I gave her the rest of the day off because I was going to stay home with my daughter. I guess I'll have to take a couple more days off from work, but I'm not complaining since I get to spend time with my favorite person. Update 3. A couple of weeks have passed since my last update. I've been very focused on my baby and also decided to start a new project, which has been quite exciting. Here's the situation with my parents and Scott. I was able to get the restraining order against Scott. Fortunately, it wasn't much of a problem because I had security footage from the day he visited me drunk and caused a scene when he realized I wasn't home. The footage is from my neighbor's camera, but as they said, I should set up my own cameras, which I will. Sometimes I laugh thinking Reddit must have some kind of deal with companies that sell cameras because it's usually the most popular advice. I guess my parents saw their situation and decided not to bother me. So, they've stayed away. My ex-in-laws informed me that after what happened to me, they've decided not to stay in contact with Scott. Apparently, he's had trouble finding other women, despite really wanting to start a family. He can't do it without a partner, and he doesn't like the idea of adopting. Maybe that explains his recent behavior. But that doesn't mean I have to forgive him, especially after everything he put me through, including what my parents did. That said, they're still trying to talk badly about me with my family, which is clearly not working. Everyone knows that they were the ones who did the worst things possible, and now they're trying to play the victim. That doesn't work, and they're learning the hard way. I'm glad they'll never be able to have contact with their granddaughter. I simply won't allow it. My daughter and I are going to live a wonderful life together, without anyone bothering us. I'll definitely be a much better mother than the one I had as an example. Update 4. This update is a bit difficult because it shows my parents' true colors, although I think we all already knew them. Until now, they hadn't reached out to me because they were blocked everywhere. Plus, according to their words, they were too ashamed to come to my house to talk to me, something Scott didn't experience despite everything he did. By the way, I haven't heard anything from him in quite some time. I have a restraining order, if you haven't read my updates, and that seems to be working for now. But definitely my parents came to my house over the weekend. Today is Wednesday, but I waited a little longer to see if they were trying anything else. When I opened the door just to tell them to leave, they said they only wanted to meet my son. I emphasize son because that's the word they used. You see, they only saw my daughter the day I ran into them by chance, and I don't usually dress my daughter in pink or very feminine clothes. She usually wears pretty neutral clothing. After all, she's a baby. She has some pink items, but I'm not one of those moms who dresses her daughter all in pink. So my parents thought she was a boy, which doesn't make much sense because she wasn't dressed like one. My daughter is only a few months old, so you can't really tell by her face whether she's a boy or a girl. Anyway, when they said son, I corrected them and told them it was my daughter. They looked confused, as if I had shattered their illusion. They continued saying they were ashamed to come speak with me after all this time, but now they wanted to meet their grandson. And again, they referred to my daughter as a boy. This time, I didn't correct them because I realized what was going on. They went on to say that after Scott's behavior, they had cut ties with him and that they simply wanted to repair the relationship between us. They also asked if the baby was home to see her, and they even bought some gifts. And yes, they were toys for boys and blue clothes and things like that. They left them at the door after leaving. Now I don't know what to do with those gifts. I'll probably donate them or give them to a friend who has a boy if her child likes those things. Her son is a bit older than mine. When they were done, I asked them if they really wanted to meet my daughter because she's a girl, not a boy. My mom said, but the other day, she wasn't dressed in pink, to which I responded with something similar to what I explained here. After that, they said they could meet her, but I could tell in their voice that they weren't very convinced. I told them she was sleeping, but they could come back in a couple of hours when it was time to feed her. They said they would, but since then, I haven't heard from them. I think they only said they wanted to meet her because once they found out she was a girl, they basically stopped bothering me. I don't know what I would have done if they had really come back, because I wasn't serious about introducing them to my daughter formally. I'm not interested in having them in my granddaughter's life. Deep down, I knew this could be their reaction, so I'm not surprised. Edit. It's been almost 2 months since what happened in this post, and no, I haven't heard anything from my parents. I guess I was right.